workforce
Yes.
is something you've talked about in your campaign. You said that obviously having a well-trained workforce is #1 to attracting businesses to the state. But right now our workforce system in the state is really disorganized. It's hard for people to navigate, and a lot of people are not happy with the outcomes it's producing. And that was one of the findings in the Kentucky Chamber's new workforce report. And in that report, we also call for the next governor to do a top-to-bottom review of the workforce system in the state. What is your feeling about that review, and how would you conduct it if you were to become governor?
Yeah, before I answer that question, let me tell you, unlike most other candidates, if I forget to answer the second part of a two-part question, that's because I forgot it. So if you don't mind reminding me, I'm not trying to dodge it, I just will forget it in some narrative.
I will remind you.
On the first point about the workforce, I've seen so many things. I've seen the coal industry claiming that low energy prices are what bring businesses here. And I've seen right to work supporters say that's if we pass this, that'll be what brings people here and we're not competitive. And then economic incentives mattering a whole lot more. Well, a good friend of mine, Greg Cook, who owns Stone Brewing Company, recently did a major expansion. He looked across the entire eastern half of the United States for some place to essentially double his U.S. capacity in. He eventually picked Richmond, and when I asked him about how that all went down, he told me that it really had more to do with, in his case, having to produce a lot of stuff that's going to be sold on the East Coast. Transportation networks were vital. Trained workforce was absolutely vital, but in his case, there were other things like he needed a particular type of water. And then a 60-acre campus that was affordable somewhere near all of this. So it turns out that decisions to move large manufacturing facilities are not made in an absolute vacuum where they're just running numbers like some kind of an economics experiment. In case in point, so like if energy costs, unions, and any of these other things that supposedly bring business were actually the prime drivers, there would be no businesses in California. But there are, and the reason why they're in California is because of trained workforce. If you wanted to set up a tech company that had a reasonable chance of succeeding in Silicon Valley, you've got the banks that know how to do it, the founders that have done it before, a trained workforce and all of that. And the rest of it, even the fact that the Bay Area is an excruciatingly expensive place to live does not stop people from starting companies there. And so it is absolutely the case that a trained workforce is the #1 primary reason why they've moved there. And as Greg told me with his expansion, he was like, if the trained workforce for what he needed to do did not exist, there is no incentive that you could offer that would get him to drop a company in. So it matters a lot. So I've been looking around trying to figure out, so of course the question would be, how do you do this? And I've seen a couple of things I like, and I'm still collecting more. One of them is the KY Fame program that the mayors of Louisville and Lexington started and expanded to about 22 counties now, which is essentially, they had the problem of advanced manufacturing is actually the biggest expanding market we have right now. And in fact, as a percentage of GDP, most people don't realize that our biggest export sector is actually aerospace technology. And that came out of nowhere recently too, actually, and just in the last few years. And it's expanding like crazy. So clearly we want to keep on doing that because advanced manufacturing is going to be the manufacturing of the future. So their solution was, so part of the problem is trained workforce. How do you do that? Well, somebody has to train them. Seems to make sense. Who could do that? So they contacted the community colleges, and they said, they contacted community colleges, manufacturers, and basically asked the question to the manufacturers, what skill sets do you need? And then they went to the community colleges and they say, can you teach this? If not, how can we connect you with the resources to be able to do this? And this is a program that funds itself, and it's already working in 22 counties. And so it seems to me the obvious step would be to expand this to the entire rest of the state, because the trained workforce matters. Along those lines also, I've been working very closely with a lot of tech incubators have realized that they can make some reasonable income off of doing basic training for technology services. So for example, I have friends that run Awesome Inc. in Lexington, and I took from them a course in Xcode, which is what you write iPhone apps on, because I'm a programmer. I code over a dozen languages, but not Xcode. And I kind of wanted to learn it because, not that I'm going to build apps. I mean, we need an app for my company, but I'm not necessarily the one who's going to build it. But so I took a day-long instructional class from them with 2 of my developers that work for me, and it was amazing. And I walked out of there and I could write apps. And it turns out that if you understand sort of basic coding procedures, picking up new languages like this is not all that difficult. But the problem that you've got is that, if you're not involved in software, you probably don't know this, but that the new languages that people use pop up and disappear on a 5-year cycle. So if you're a university, your problem is, well, how do you decide what to teach? Because even if you knew the day that a new computer language becomes the thing we're all going to jump to, even if you knew, and usually we don't, as a university, you then have to find somebody, like first of all, identify this as the thing we want to teach, find somebody who's qualified to teach it, develop curriculum, and implement all of this in time for the next thing to completely wash this first thing out. And so in particular, the Awesome Inc. guys are working with the college system in the state to try to see if they can provide an augmentation for that, which is basically, you guys teach all the theory in computer science, and then we will then catch these people right as they come out, and then we'll implement okay, now you know how to code, now here's Xcode, now here's Ruby on Rails, now here's PHP, here's Perl, here's whatever you need. Because they can move quicker, and it doesn't replace anything universities currently do, it augments them. The reason why this matters is because computer programmers are in high demand. In fact, I was talking to Nick over there, and he says that there's at least 5,000 unfilled programming jobs right now, and these are high-dollar jobs. I mean, we're talking like easily like upper 5, lower 6 figures, depending on where you're at. And to be able to train somebody who doesn't know how to code currently to be able to code, it's not necessarily something everybody can do, but if you could do it, that could substantially improve not only your life, but the lives of your children and your grandkids, and then ends up having a net direct benefit of revenue to the state that pays for itself within about 5 years. And so programs like these are the things that we need to work on expanding for all the reasons I just laid out.
And I'll get back to technology in a second,
yeah.
But back to the workforce report from the Kentucky Chamber.
Yes, that's right, thank you.
We did call for the next governor to do a complete review, including bringing in an outside entity
yes.
to kind of look over everything before cabinet structure is even finalized. Because there's a lot of money spent on workforce programs in the state, and businesses are not completely happy with what's coming out. So how would you conduct that type of audit? Yeah,
so there's two ways that to do it, because interestingly, I'd been thinking along the same lines, but I've got a couple of tweaks to the idea. One is that it's a good idea to sort of like independent third party, yes, no doubt. Then you want to go through to find out where the inefficiencies exist. Is there overlapping, and there is in many cases. Friends of mine who, for example, like own brewing companies talk about the licensing process and having to go through 20 different organizations. If you could, I have a friend of mine who's willing to build a tool actually, which would sort of adjust. It's like, so you want to do what? And his initial idea was file to run for governor. Okay, well then the tool goes and basically assembles, okay, steps 1 through 20. It goes into the system, it catalogs what needs to be done, and it just builds it up for you. And he said, that's not too hard to build. I know how to code, he's right. So that would be a good step. As far as the review of state employees, I would like to offer an additional suggestion to it, which is, so I got an MBA recently in 2011 and 2012 because apparently I hate spare time. And one of the classes that was taught that I sat in on a few of them because it got really interesting was called Turnarounds, which is the science of going into a company that has failed and turning it around. It was taught by a guy named Peter Goodson, who incidentally was one of the people who brokered the initial deal at Lexmark in the 1990s, so he's familiar with the area. And one of the things that they did, which I thought was particularly intriguing, is that top-down review is a good idea. You must also do a bottom-up. And the reason why is a lot of the inefficiency actually exists at the administrative level. And so it turns out that if you ask the rank and file employees to review their administrators, oftentimes you can find the ones that are completely useless. There are not a lot of false positives that pop out of this. I mean, somebody might not like someone, but generally speaking, the ones that are not effective are fairly obvious in a review like this. And so I would go both directions on that. I would also start on a subset of state government first, just in case, because tackling the entire thing at once is going to be a monster task, and things will be learned by doing it on a small scale first. So I would start with maybe a very small branch of government, implement those ideas, figure out what we learned, and then say, okay, do we think we can scale this? Or if we can't, if we can scale it, good, let's do it. If we cannot scale it, well, so then in order, like what are the top 5 branches we probably ought to take a look at, and so we can get the maximum amount of good done within the least amount of time. So those are the things I would add to that.
Okay, and back on technology,
yes.
On your campaign site, when you talk about jobs, you talked about technology quite a bit, and you even mentioned Eastern Kentucky and said technology could be a way to kind of revamp that region. Tell me a little bit about what you mean there and how we bring technology jobs or just let it help Eastern Kentucky. Yeah,
so my first experience with this was I went to the SOAR conference this spring, and it was fascinating to me because I was born and raised in Central Kentucky, and I've lived here all my life, and my dad worked for the Public Defender's Office and traveled around a bit, so they had 15 branch offices, and I've been to all of those places in the state multiple times. And growing up, it didn't seem like there was a lot of interest in that kind of thing. You know, people were just kind of doing the thing they were doing and nobody cared. I go to Pikeville though in the spring, and lo and behold, everybody's talking about broadband and technology, and we got to learn how to code and all these things. And I was like, wow, everybody's ready for this. Like, this is game on. So that was really interesting, because that would mean that if you have a technology-minded governor like myself, that means you don't have to make the pitch, hey, you guys need this. They know, they got it. So then the question is, well then, so how do you do that? How do you encourage that? So there's a model that I'm aware of that isn't a government model purely, but there's a guy named Brad Feld who founded a company called Techstars, similar to Y Combinator. And Brad is a business acquaintance of mine, and he, in the late 90s, cashed out a .com1 company somewhere and then moved to Boulder, Colorado because he wanted to. Today, Boulder, Colorado is a tech hub. And the reason why isn't just because Brad Feld moved there. That helped. But one of the things he did was he worked with the local government and the local university system, and basically said, and then gathered up some more local investors and said, how can we all make sure this happens? Because it requires the input of all three types of people. You need to have the business sector, you need the university, and you need government involved. And not one single one of those can pull it off themselves. And so the reason why I find that intriguing is because I've been to Boulder, Colorado a few times, and it's really similar to Pikeville. It's a mountain town, and people who are outdoorsy types. It turns out computer programmers also are avid outdoorsmen for some reason. I'm not sure why that is, but and so the way you attract a class of coders is you make a place that they want to live first and foremost, and then they start showing up. And if it can be done in Boulder, Colorado, like, people don't remember that 20 years ago Boulder, Colorado was known for Mork and Mindy, and that's about it. But today it's a thriving tech hub like Austin. And that was how they did it, basically, because coders want to live at the places that are good to live in. And having been to Pikeville for the first time in 5 years recently, I can say I was impressed, really impressed. Like, that's a place that I could actually live. And so we've got a really good base here. And I think that's how we start.